Welcome back. Now, Finance Minister Nkomo says National Treasury will continue to prioritize South Africa's fiscal and social needs in the 2025 budget. He briefed the media yesterday on the contentious fiscal framework. Nkomo has announced that a new budget will be tabled on the 21st of May. For more on this, let's speak to development economist Phelisa Nkomo, who joins us now. Phelisa, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciated as well then on this early rise on Workers' Day then. So the finance minister ultimately saying that he will now be prioritizing fiscal as well as social needs. Is this not what he should have done initially?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think it's also just some of these concepts are just used like a cliche. In fact, I hope the journalists who were at the media briefing should have asked and said, so break it down. Because that's what fiscal framework is about. It's about where you get your income, the revenue, the debt management, etc., and expenditure issues. So, and I think given the socio-economic crisis and growth crisis in South Africa, that should always be a priority on a daily basis for any, anyone who is in the public governance system, or also anyone who's been entrusted with the responsibility of allocating public resources, allocating resources. So I'm actually quite shocked by the use of that concept as though it's actually something new. But I do think that though that what he had experienced was a serious wake-up call.
Yes.
Because I actually went through some of this. I mean, during this period, there's a lot of material that gets exchanged either in WhatsApp groups. So I came across a video where he says, oh, no, we don't owe anyone an explanation about how we allocate, resources or how we do our budget. And I was saying that I don't think the minister actually fully understands what's the constitutional obligations that they have. Is that at the heart of South Africa's constitutionalism is public participation, is ensuring that citizens are brought to speed to anything that gets to take place either in Parliament or that gets a decision that gets taken within the cabinet.
Yeah. Phelisa, I mean, you bring up an issue that I was going to speak to you about a little bit later on, but since you're on it already, on that basis alone, is that enough to create a situation in which the finance minister may need to tender some kind of resignation or need to be relieved of his duties?
Look, it's the president who has to make that decision. There could be public pressure for citizens if they feel that he has actually erred and that he, in this context, he's not really been, undertaking his responsibility in a judicious way. So I think citizens could put that pressure, but ultimately, it's the president that has to make that decision if he believes that he's not executing his work very well. I think the parliamentary system does not really allow, unlike, in other countries where if you have a constituency-based system and constituencies can make a decision that we are of the view that this MP no longer serves its constituency, therefore they need to resign. There could be public pressure, but ultimately it's the president that has to make that decision.
Yeah. All right. Third time lucky, supposedly, for this budget then. If VAT is not going to go up, if taxes are not going to go up, where's South Africa going to get that money from?
In fact, one of the key things I was actually, when I read the statement, South Africans need to pay attention to several things. And I like it. There's a line right towards the end of the media statement that says, South African citizens, political parties need to immerse themselves very deeply with the complex issues of national budgeting, allocation of resources, etc. And I like that line because I think, as I was saying, that it was a bit of a wake-up call for him. But also at the same time is that we also need to be aware that the national budgeting should not be used for posturing or, posturing for it's a bit of a chessboard, political chessboard. People have to be really genuine about what they're looking for, or because the reality is that while we are aware specifically that the DA was actually against the VAT, but at the same time it was using VAT to actually negotiate for certain things. But the biggest issue for me that actually we need to pay attention to. There are three components within the budget. He makes the point about debt stabilization, which is it's a concern which does give what we call limited fiscal space. I mean, literally about 26% that gets spent on the real issues. He raises the issue about debt borrowing strategy, debt stabilization. He then says that then means that the fiscal framework have to be confident. And I think there's an opportunity now he knows that South Africans have a stake in the national budget, not from just allocating resources, but also to raise their hands on how to prioritize resources. He needs to articulate what that, particularly the borrowing strategy. Because South Africa, I mean, it borrows at 9% interest rate in the financial markets. So in essence, that's a high risk. I mean, that's a high interest rate, and we're actually paying just above 200 billion in servicing debt.
Yeah.
So therefore, it's really something that we need to pay attention to. And then it means that we need to really start thinking about where are the sources of revenue. Because remember, there's a correlation between your ability to grow, to borrow, but also at the same time, your ability to grow. I mean, we've been confronted with a growth crisis in this country for the last 10 years. And he's correct in his statement that says the priority of the state is actually drive economic growth, right? And we've not been seeing that coming through to the budget. I mean, we're sitting with austerity measures. In fact, we are nervous as ordinary citizens that he's likely to start cutting on hospital allocation, school allocation, and which is, it's the social cluster, but as well as he may not even be able to give a lot of money to drive the economy. I do think that part of where he is now is it's time to stop using linear forms of macroeconomic policies, but also to really start looking at borrowing other macroeconomic policies that will actually deliver something that is a lot more better.
What could those be? What could those be exactly? Because it's a tough balancing act, right? We're saying we need more money, but we can't increase the sources of that revenue unless SARS, of course, collects more money, which means that capacitating SARS may be very important here. But at the same time, the consumer is struggling, so the money to be able to put that out into the government revenue pot is also a bit of a struggle too. At the same time, the cutting of spending seems to be an element that he's struggling with because he may end up cutting in departments that need the funding the most, especially if you look at areas like health, which now need more funding because of the loss of funding we've had from the United States, etc. How difficult a balancing act is this going to be?
No, it's actually going to be difficult. But, Arabile, every crisis presents an opportunity, right? So we are aware last year we were actually in the similar position, and they got about 150 billion from the gold reserves. But we're also saying that, I mean, one of the key things, and that's why there was a serious contestation about the VAT issue, was that you can't be taking from South Africans who don't have anything else. So meaning that actually he has reached a ceiling point regarding the macroeconomic policy that the Minister of Finance and the National Treasury team have actually been using, right? So South Africa is classified, let me just take Tito for a second, is classified as an emerging economy, very similar to South Korea, if we stay there. And South Korea has recovered so fast out of both COVID, a global financial crisis, because the nature of how the state invests its resources. Firstly, South Africa, amongst the key things that our macroeconomics policy promotes is that the state has no role in the economy. That's really problematic when we have a history of racial exclusion, gender exclusion, right? Meaning that the citizens who have a history of being excluded for 300 years will perpetually be on the margins because they actually rely on state. But also it also means that we're going to use policies that have a very minimal impact, right? So the first issue, for instance, it's how you use public procurement as a lever to drive transformation. It means that our public policy procurement needs to be less risk averse and grant black people an opportunity to participate. The second one is access to funding. The third one is increased spending on industrial development. The fourth one, convert this country into a construction site. Invest in rail infrastructure, road infrastructure. And all those things require governments to step up. You can't have an economy that has been growing at less than 1%. I mean, we've just had our growth projection revised by IMF. I was even surprised when he presented the budget and says we're going to be growing at 1.9%. I was thinking, what assumptions is he referring to? Now, interestingly, with the VAT, he says we need to start revising our assumptions. But where were these assumptions that was going to grow the economy to 1.9% coming from? Because the VAT was actually going to give us less than 30 billion, by the way, the 0.1% if it was split over 2 years. So it was actually overall was going to give us 60 billion on average, maybe 68, but very little, right?
Wow.
But also the risk is that it will also mean that it was going to leave a lot more families, a lot more poor, because VAT, everyone else, anyone who consumes in the economy is always going to be paying VAT.
Yes.
So it also means that then people in return, you're going to have more numbers that are going to be sitting in the social security, which now they've increased just above 23 million. So, and I think for me, the biggest issue is that as long as our own economic architecture is so polarized within a treasury, there's no collaborative thinking within the economic cluster on what needs to be done and how the budget gets allocated.